Hello, so today is just going to be basically a rant video, and what it's going to be about is it's just going to be about the books I read in 2021. Ever since 2019, I've been keeping a list of all the books I read for the year, just on whimsy actually, and this video is going to be released ahead of me talking to one of my friends, Co. We're both going to talk to each other about the books that we read in 2021. By the way, congratulations to her. She's tying the knot, and apologies to her husband's back because I've given her a lot of books over the years, and when they move, man, is he going to haul that stuff. So I try to pick a theme every year for my reading list, and this year's theme was Get Hard. It was about engaging with maybe a bit more difficult literature. When I talk to people who read, especially a lot of young men, their introduction is sort of YA stuff. Like their introduction to sci-fi, for example, will be the Star Wars extended universe and all that other stuff, or novelizations about comic book characters. I'm not saying that those are bad things, but I do think you need to transcend those things and engage with harder literature. If you like that kind of sci-fi stuff, go up one and try to read Dune or things of that nature, Foundations that are a bit more philosophical. If you like fantasy, try to read Pillars of the Earth, which is about the establishment of a cathedral in a city and what it means for the medieval peasantry, or try to engage with Mists of Avalon, a sort of low fantasy where there's magic, but there's very little magic, stuff such as that. So, the first book up was The Old Man in the Sea, and this, I had read Hemingway before, but only a short story of his. This is, of course, the classic man versus nature tale, written with very in-depth knowledge of fishing, commercial fishing especially. Then the second book I read in 2021 was Slaughterhouse-Five. People have asked me how to describe this, and I guess the best way to describe it is to say that it's a military fiction absurdist satire. I guess that'd be the best way to describe it. There's a lot of people who kind of wonder about this book for a while, such as myself, when really stop wondering about it and read it. It's a very engaging book. It's almost impossible to put down. You're going to really enjoy it. And this kind of had an edge to it when I was in high school. People, read Kurt Vonnegut when I was in high school were kind of considered that outsider pack there. The third book I read in 2021 was The Alchemist. And I actually bought Old Man in the Sea, The Alchemist, and Slaughterhouse-Five the same day. If somebody got me a gift certificate to Barnes & Nobles, and I really enjoyed that. And the Alchemist is a fantasy. It's sort of low fantasy with not a lot of mystical or magical elements and no sort of race of elves or orcs or anything like that. One long Aesop's fable, but very good, very engaging. I mean, the book has sold tens of millions of copies worldwide. It was a huge phenomenon when it was released, and I definitely know why. In The Garden of Beasts is about the Dodd family, which was sent to be an embassy family in Berlin when Hitler was rising to power. Very interesting book. It was written by Erik Larson. And if you want a nice book about the subject that's not, 700 pages long, this book is for you. This was a quick read just about the Air Force campaign on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This one had really small print, so it was actually pretty hard for me to read. Now, this book is Darwin, Portrait of a Genius, but really what this book is more so about was just about the initial publication about Origin of the Species, things that led up to it, and more particularly the non-controversy when it was released. Although it would go on to be very controversial, there was actually a lot of theories at the time. Pretty much a lot of people in England, then in Europe, sort of shrugged off the idea of young Earth creationism. Well, young Earth creationism wasn't even really a thing at that point. So every year I make it a point to read like a book that in some ways tied with my childhood. And Nancy Drew is the first book I remember spending some money on. It was actually a one-off book that I spent it on. It was Nancy Drew Ghost Stories. So I read The Secret of the Old Clock, and I got this book from a free library. One of those libraries you see just freestanding, that's kind of a box that contains a lot of books. This one actually had things that really related to my life, though. I have been helped with sleuthing by a Russian guy, and I did know somebody who was involved in corporate espionage that had to do with the airline industry. That's the burning playing in the background there right next to the heart. And this is actually part of a 3-part series, so I'm going to probably finish it up this year. The Book of the Law. So, is Aleister Crowley an icon? I would say he definitely is. Because he's, he died in his early 70s, and he's been sort of existing in the pop culture for longer than he was alive. So you could definitely say he has iconic status. The Book of the Law is often referenced in popular culture, so I decided to read it myself. Quick read, it was basically his version of, it was sort of his testament or whatever, and hey, it got him remembered. I think his legacy is going to live long, because so many of the things, even if people nowadays don't know it, like the pagan movement and all that, were sort of Crowley's teachings co-opted. The Communist Manifesto. I admit that I had never read this before, and a lot of people I know have never read the Communist Manifesto. They're just happy to read commentaries about it. I decided, hey, why don't I read the actual thing? And to be honest with you, some of it is comedy, because it, talks about how people should move back onto the farms. And I'm thinking, man, all the academics I know who are into Marx, they wouldn't last like 10 minutes without a Starbucks, let alone know how to raise their own food. So I confess to having never read Agatha Christie. So this year I decided to read this, which I believe I also got from a free library, and then there were none. Every American television series that goes for like more than 3 seasons has an episode that follows this vein of, 10 guests and they disappear one by one. James Patterson, All-American Murder. I actually do like it when a fiction author breaches into nonfiction, because at least they're very good at telling a story. And this read very quick. Mitch Albom, Finding Chica. So, Mitch Albom, local author actually, and this references a lot of places in Ann Arbor. This is about him helping out at like a girls and boys home in Haiti. Somebody gets a terminal disease. So, The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. I had never really read anything outside his graphic novels, so this was that, and for what it was, yeah, I liked it. Frankenstein. Okay, this is the classic. Had tried to read it when I was really, really young. I think still in grade school or middle school, and couldn't quite do it. Came back, finished it. Good book. The Richard Stryker Jr. Murder. So I had first learned about this incident when I was taking a lantern-lit tour of Highland Cemetery in Ypsilanti. And it's really cool because it raises funds and whatnot, and this historian gives you an actual oil-burning lantern to walk through, and he takes you to famous and sometimes infamous graves within the cemetery. I found this to be a fascinating story, and also in 2021, I did my lantern tour of the cemetery on October 31st, Halloween. The Barbarian Way. Again, this is just a book I found for free. I actually found it at EMU's campus at the various book stands that are set up in some of the buildings where faculty and students just leave books. Very interesting thing by the guy who leads the Mosaic movement. The Lost City of Z. So I actually saw the movie first, and then I read the book. This is interesting, and it was about a gentleman named Percy Fawcett who tries to find this city that he thinks once existed. Now, there was actually a city that existed where he was walking through that was long, long gone. Thing was, he was looking for like sort of upright standing structures and stuff for remains. Never kind of realized that the whole area he was exploring was actually kind of a buried city. Of Mice and Men. So this book and a few others. So here in Michigan, the libraries didn't open up till sometime in August, at least the libraries near me. And so I did this thing where I would get a book and try to read it while entirely inside of a library. Just go in the library, not leave till I read it. Of Mice and Men was the first I did that with. And either the day I read this, or I think maybe the day after, I was getting a ride home from work, and I asked we got talking about books with the guy who was giving me a ride. And I asked him what his favorite book was. He goes, Of Mice and Men. So I thought that was an interesting experience. Barabbas. Okay, for those of you who are watching that maybe haven't read the Bible in a while or aren't Christian, Barabbas was the person excused in the place of Christ being executed. This book is really interesting and kind of gets into what would life have been like for a brigand or whatever you want to call it back in that day when life was kind of bad for everybody just because of life expectancy and the harsh brutality of, desert dwelling. Then factor on, living oppressed under the Roman Empire. It's a depressing book. I don't ever recommend reading the two books back to back. So this was actually part of a literary challenge I gave myself, Try Hard, and that is try to read 3 books in one day. So the Friends of Eddie Coyle kind of got a second life when in a very recent lecture that's on YouTube, somebody had a picture of Stephen King and asked Stephen King to sign it at the lecture. And they were wondering what book he was holding in the photo, and it was The Friends of Eddie Coyle. This was a pretty good book where dialogue is sort of the main vehicle. Gritty. Rumblefish by Essie Hinton. This is the 3rd book I read by her. She wrote the book The Outsiders. And of course, The Outsiders probably stands, and I know some people might criticize this, is one of the best YA books out there. And then Common Sense by Thomas Paine. So this was part of a week called Nonstop No-Fic, which is try to read as many nonfiction books in 1 week as you can. I believe I read 3. Tuesdays with Morrie is Mitch Albom's best known work. And it's funny because I actually read 2 books by Mitch Albom. And I was like, I really got to get around to reading his most famous book. Tuesdays with Morrie is, him talking to a professor that he had who's dying. Hillbilly Elegy. This sparked a lot of controversy when it came out. A memoir of a family and culture in crisis. J.D. Vance talking about how he went from being definitely amongst the poor or lower class to becoming either a Harvard or Yale lawyer. I'm sorry if I don't remember the specifics on that. The Professor and the Madman. So this is a book about a book. Really. This was about the establishment of the Oxford English Dictionary, how 2 of the people who contributed the most words were both Americans, and they were both freaking mad. Under the Black Flag. So Under the Black Flag is one that I don't think I got around to in 1 week of the Nonstop No-Fic, but I read it afterwards. The romance and the reality of life among the pirates. If you're into history and you were in the Navy, this is going to be an interesting book for you. If you just like pirates, also an interesting book. But do be warned, this doesn't talk about piracy everywhere. It talks about specifically like the Spanish Main or the Caribbean. So, September is for space operas. So I read the first book in the Foundation series in September. I also read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Extremely funny. So then we move to October reading list. So in October, I give myself this challenge to try to read a horror book, try to read a nonfiction horror book, a book that's about a haunting or something like that. So at least I try to read 2 books during October that center on horror. So I read The Phantom of the Opera, and I read Bram Stoker's Dracula. I read Under the Banner of Heaven, which I initially purchased as part of those 5 books for Nonstop No-Fic that included, Under the Black Flag and The Professor and the Madman and all that. This ended up to be the most screwed up story of the lot, though. Although not a horror book, it gets into the sectarian violence that happens among Mormon fundamentalists. This was just a cool book, The Modern Detective, How Corporate Intelligence is Reshaping the World. I'm an online sleuth, for those of you who don't know. Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses. This was part of a challenge I gave myself called Cemetery Showdown, and that is try to read an entire book in a cemetery. You don't have to do it in one setting, but go to your local cemetery or graveyard or whatever you want to call it, and read a book while you're there. And I had a very bad November in terms of book reading. I tried to read 2 books at once. That never seems to work out for me. But I did finish this book. It was I tried really hard to make an October read, but hey. So the Penguin Book of Witches. This is that category of sort of non-fiction horror. Now, do you believe in witches? Okay, no, and these probably weren't witches. But either way, people believed it to be true at the time. Then Rise of the Warrior Cop. This is a good book because it takes aim at the trouble with modern policing, at the people who need aim taken at, and that is politicians. People don't realize police do not write and draft laws. The tough on crime politicians you elect to clean up the streets do. Stephen King's The Shining was the final book I read this year, and in a really screwed up way, it was very autobiographical for me. Of course, you don't know the plot of The Shining. A man moves into a hotel with his family over the winter to be sort of the caretaker and watch out for the place because it's not occupied during the winter. And he goes, and the main guy goes insane, becomes obsessed with the hotel and everything like that. And this reminded me of when I lived at a place in, Brownstown. So we moved into this house, which, my family definitely could not afford, let me tell you that. And, my father kind of went insane and became obsessed with young flesh. He was doing all these just crazy things. One point in time, a 16-year-old girl shacked up with him, went around to frickin' schools and was giving out cell phones to little girls. I mean, really, really crazy stuff. I've always wondered if there wasn't, just something about this house that didn't make my father do the crazy crap he did. Because, you can't really do that, but maybe capitalized on some. Either way, when I passed that house, no good memories of the place. So, that is my reading list for 2021. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed making this content. I hope to read lots of good books in 2022.